Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Web Platform Podcast, now recommended by 4 of 5 web developers. I'm your host this week, Justin Ribeiro, and returning to the show, friend of the show, wonderful person, Sharon. How are you doing, Sharon?
I'm doing good.
And today we're talking about Riot.js, a little introduction to tell you about a very cool new library / awesome tooling that you can use for your next project. And we have Richard and Gianluca here to talk about it. Hello, gentlemen. How are you doing today?
Yeah, everything fine. Hi everyone.
So tell us a little bit about yourselves. Gianluca, why don't you start?
Okay, so basically I'm a web developer. I work in Switzerland, and honestly my background is a bit different from the normal web developer career because I studied psychology. And somehow I started working on computer programming stuff. I really liked, I do HTML since almost 10 years. HTML, JavaScript, I worked for several companies. And right now I'm working here in Switzerland for an awesome company. It's called Bondi Interactive. And yeah, I didn't start with Riot, but since 1 year, I became contributor of the project, and now I'm kicking it out, adding a release, and it's running really well.
Awesome. So, Richard, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, I taught myself to program from reading books, if anybody remembers what those things are. At one time, that's how we did things. We opened the books and we typed in the example codes to learn it and compile it and get 100 errors from 10 lines of code. And so that's where I started teaching myself. I've worked in industrial automation for many, many years, programming machines to do automated production and that kind of thing. I went on into building automation, which is similar but not near as exciting. And I started branched off from that on my own back in 2009 and have been working independently. Mostly web, but a lot, variety of different things I still work on.
These days, it seems like everyone has quite a variety of different things to work on. It's always interesting to, the web converges in so many places these days that it's hard to miss, so to speak, whether you're using the APIs and whatever native and/or machine thing you're doing, or just the web in general. So that's fantastic, gentlemen. So good to have you on the show. Great to have you. So let's talk about Riot.js. Riot.js is it's been out for a little while now. It's somewhat like a React-like library. So tell us a little bit about Riot. What is it? Why should we care as a web developer who needs things and such?
So should I start, Richard? It's okay for you?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, Riot is a library that was developed by Moot. That is a company. Actually was developed by Zero at Moot, and they kicked out this library with version 1 that was pretty small. Actually, the version number 2 was pretty awesome. I started working on it since 1 year, and basically it's really a simple library. It's something that you shouldn't wrap your head around it and waste hours and hours trying to understand how the API works and how many methods you can use, and it's basically a simple wrapper around the normal JavaScript that you use daily. And I started working on it because I felt this was a democratic community. It wasn't really driven by a huge company like Google or Facebook, or it was really community driven. And I felt like home. there is a team of awesome developers working on the project. Anyone brings his own skills on it, improving it constantly, and that's what Riot is basically a democratic community around a small project that tries to make web and JavaScript development a bit easier for anyone.
Richard, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I was attracted to Riot with version 2 when it came out, and started playing with it, and was really amazed at, I told you my history, how far back I go, and in all that time I have not found anything that had such a well laid out, easy to follow pattern for development that had such a short learning curve that you're up and running in hours. It has a limited amount of API calls, and you can do pretty much what you need to do with just a short amount or a small amount of tools that are available. So you don't have to go memorizing, in this case I need to use this, and in that case I need to use that. You memorize a few basic things, and a lot of it is built on what we already know, the HTML layout, JavaScript, and CSS, and that's all easily integrated into it. And the JavaScript part of it in your templates are evaluated inline as expressions. So, most of us already know JavaScript, we already know HTML, and it's put together in a way that just makes so much sense when you look at it. And that's what attracted me to it, and that's what I think attracts a lot of the people in the community, which seems to be growing pretty steadily. I mean, I always see new issues posted by people I haven't seen before, and they just keep being drawn towards it.
And so you talk about sort of the HTML and JavaScript that sort of goes into creating sort of a Riot sort of component. And the documentation sort of says, oh, it's somewhat React-like. I mean, how does it compare to something like React? If you're a React developer today, is it easy to make that jump into Riot? I mean, how is it React-like?
I have not used React, so it's kind of hard for me to answer. I've looked at it, and looking at it, there are similarities. I think one thing that is different about it, from what I could see from their example, is that the Riot layout is HTML with your functions inside, and the React is kind of reverse of that. You have your function, and in it you call your render function, which has the JSX, which is a lot cleaner form of HTML than just trying to print out strings in that. But it seems like you're making a component, you wrap its functionality inside of the HTML. Seems to make more sense, and I think anyone coming from React would be able to pick up on that pretty quickly. And on their example, getting back to that, it seems like you have your render function, but then they're doing a to-do list and they're creating a list item, and you need to call a function because that needs to be created. Whereas Riot, it's all just inline. You just do your markup like you would, and your list item just goes in line, and you attach whatever attributes you want to it.
Okay. So if we're going with the comparison to React, when you're building a React application, short of just having a collection of components, you'd need usually some kind of like state management. Is React more like, is Riot more like it handles some of that stuff for you, so it's more like a mini Angular Ember, or is it more strictly like handling the view layer, and you'd need to kind of use some other libraries to handle some of that?
Gianluca, are you there? I see you're muted. If you want to chime in here.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Sorry, my connection is pretty bad. I think the difference between Riot and React is I mostly work with a team of 7, 8 guys, and actually those guys basically are PHP developers, Python developers, Ruby developers. Not all of them have the knowledge to understand what actually JavaScript does, what a Node.js program does. And the thing is that the problem I always have with other tools like React is that somehow the boilerplate you need to run a project is pretty big. And when you need to explain that to your working colleagues, it's hard to get them involved. It's what to let them understand really what's happening under the hood. With Riot.js, I basically solved all those problems because Riot it combines two things. It's small because it uses the good stuff that we could get from the DOM and from JavaScript. This is really important. The reason we don't want to reinvent the wheel is that Riot basically reuses what we already know about JavaScript and about the DOM. If I have an onTouch start event, I don't want a re-implementation of an onTouch start event. Basically, we reuse that event and we hook it in Riot. And the problem is with React that basically you need to have a basic underground about how JavaScript works to understand how React works. But with Riot, the most obvious thing about your template or your component is in the end your final solution. It takes for me 5 minutes to explain to an old PHP developer doing in my template, in my component. And this is not the same I could get with any other framework out there, neither with Backbone, Angular. I really have tried a lot of frameworks, but in the end, the answer is always the same. What are you doing here? I don't understand. With Riot, you solve this problem because it's the most obvious thing. So it's less opinionated.
So then I suppose the React-like portion, to Sharon's sort of question, like when I first read the documentation as well, the first thing I thought was that it seems like it's more of an Ember Angular comparison is more relevant to some extent in terms of the way that it does things as opposed to the React portion. But I know that in the documentation, for instance, for instance, Riot uses a virtual DOM, just a simpler one is what the documentation says. Which a lot of people associate virtual DOM these days with, or DOM rather, with sort of the way React does DOM diffing, virtual DOM diffing on their side. Is that to some extent, is that why there's a comparison in terms of it's kind of React-like where I have a virtual DOM and this has a virtual DOM, and are they roughly the same sort of approach to virtual DOM? Like how does Riot approach virtual DOM in comparison to something say like React?
Do you want answer, Richard?
Okay. I don't really know much about what they do under the hood in that, but it is more of a presentation type component. So I think in that way it's more like React and as compared to Angular or Ember along that lines. And plus it was inspired. The original creator said, "Hey, React does this. They have this JSX, so we can lay out, in this kind of form." And they just kind of turned that into the, like I said before, they just reversed it a little bit, so where you have your functions defined inside your HTML, and it's more of a block. As far as the virtual DOM, it is basically you're storing what needs to be rendered, and whenever something actual changes in what's being stored, then you go and update the actual DOM. I'm not sure if I explained that very well. Maybe Gianluca, he's our main guy. He's the one that's active, most of the time on the project. I'm in and out on it, so let's see if we get a better answer here.
So basically, we have two things. We have a template engine and we have the DOM. So the template engine allows us to get from a string whatever we want from a JavaScript object. In this case, it could be a Riot instance or whatever we want. And basically, Riot does get the object value and renders it in the DOM element. So the virtual DOM in React basically compares some strings. I don't know how exactly the virtual DOM works in React, but in React it's pretty simple. We hash the expressions we need to render on any update, and whenever a property gets updated, we update the value in the DOM. Really, it's really simple. We are really trying to reuse what actually we got already. So if you have attribute on a DOM node, basically that attribute is going to be updated whenever it's needed. So whenever that property, that expression, we use expressions for that. Whenever that expression changes its value, it's really, let's say, I have a title in my page, an H1, and there is expression in our template engine that says to Riot, please render the title. Title could be a property coming from whatever object. This title would be updated just if that property is going to change. That's our virtual DOM. So on any update, we loop all the expressions, we check which one has been changed, and then we re-render it in the DOM.
So it's basically
that's how it works.
Yeah. So basically, it's basically expression to node mapping, right? Is that basically what it's doing? You're saying exactly. I'm going to go.
Exactly.
I'm going to loop through this thing.
You got it.
So it's not actually creating a secondary DOM and diffing it against, because I mean
exactly.
the kicker with React is right is that React's power comes from the fact that it uses basically it has its own DOM, that virtual piece that's the actual DOM that it dips against, that creates that sort of update chain. And this is basically expression to existing nodes within the DOM map. Is that about right? Do I have that about right?
Exactly. You got it. You got it. So basically, I think React, they compare strings, or your template in React is a string interpolated with JavaScript property, and Riot, on the other hand, has a template, and whenever an expression in this template must be updated, we update it. That's how it works, and it's really simple. That's what takes the size of the library really small, because we don't want to re-implement what we already got from the DOM.
So in terms of if I was a React developer and I understood sort of how React does sort of its diff, and I came to Riot and said, so basically it's not exactly one-to-one, right? Like they have different approaches. Like you both have different approaches to basically make updates into your tree, so to speak, right? You're saying I'm going to do it this way. So the performance, my presumption is the performance characteristics are different. Would that be about right? Or are they very similar in roughly testing? Like if I'm doing, if I'm doing updates in either lib, right? Am I going to get similar performance against that?
So you are hitting an important point here. The thing is that we're hardly working on this on Riot, and the problem is that some users, they pretend to move the DOM node, for example, in lib according to their column. Reality renders both the DOM node automatically because it just renders string, and this is a different method to render DOM elements. So the problem is that React actually is faster than Riot. We can't compare them because they use totally different rendering engine. the thing is that on Riot, on the other hand, we are trying to get the best of what we actually have from the DOM. We are implementing a new technology on the top, the current HTML and JavaScript technology. That's the big difference, because, okay, you get better performances, but in the end, you also need to stick to different kind of technology, like flux, like stores, and so on. With Riot, you don't have this problem. You can do your UI however you want. And honestly, I've built many projects with Riot today. I've built really huge forms, big collections, and I never had problems, performances problems. Those performances problems, they come out just when a guy publishes an issue on GitHub. Hey, I'm rendering thousands of leaves in my application and it gets slow. But in this case, the problem, I would say, the problem is you shouldn't do this in JavaScript. That's my opinion. But of course, I'm just stuff. You are not rendering thousands of DOM nodes, right? You don't have any kind of problem.
Well, and sure, you have to take a different approach based on sort of what you're sort of rendering, right? So I mean, you know, there are lots of libraries and sort of approaches within any given set to render large amounts of items. You know, for Tony Caspero over at Netflix. He did a great thing about chasing 60 frames a second. Last year, he did a talk on, you know, how do you get 60 frames per second out of Yact and like the approaches they took. And then you have things like on Polymer side, right, with Iron List, which will do 60 frames a second straight away for thousands and thousands of items. So there are approaches, and my presumption is that you can take similar approaches with Riot. It's just a matter of figuring out what the implementation detail is of that thing. Would that be correct?
Yeah, the next version of Riot is totally focused on that. So we're working on the version number 3 of the library. That is, by the way, a big change compared to the second version of the library. The focus is totally on the list performances. We have actually a couple of implementations of that. The thing is that you need to consider that Riot is it's a project developed by people from all over the world, and we don't work. We are not a big company like Facebook. So actually, we need to work on it on our spare time. And I could understand a lot of users that they require always more. They want always more, and they want to push the library forward. But you need to consider that Riot is a library actually developed by a small group of people, and we need to take our time to implement those stuff. The version number 3 is gonna come slowly, I think, in the middle of this year, but we're gonna solve all the problems we had with the previous version. So there were issues actually that weren't solved, like the conditional evaluation, expression issues, performances, nested child problems. But now we are working on it, and we will release a great version number 3. I think it's gonna be awesome.
I want to add something here too. What he was saying about, you know, just us being a small group without the backing of a big company. If you go and look at the number of individual contributors we have, though, I mean, we do get a lot of community support, and you know, that's how we all started. The Moot who started the project, they're not really active at all, any of them, and we all started just by contributing. We liked the project. We said, hey, okay, here's a feature that's needed. Let's, you know, put that together, commit it, and then after doing that enough times, you know, we join the team. So yes, we are small, but we do have a lot of different contributors, and we are reaching a lot of people. So as far as the community, we have a pretty good community, and we're always getting contributions on a regular basis.
I always look at that because it's a concern when you're looking at a library that's, community based and it's really just one or two people, and you have the as they call it, the bus problem. What happens if this person, well, not necessarily hit by a bus? It's usually they get a new job and they use a new framework, but it's a problem, and it's the opposite problem that the big companies sponsored frameworks have. But having a vibrant community is very important.
Yeah, and you guys have been growing quite a bit, and there's some things that
you're
Riot
right.
sort of does differently than, because you talk about it being a library, but it actually has features that you wouldn't necessarily associate with the library, like routing and things like that. I mean, what kind of features does Riot have that people may not know about?
They have a observable, which is a way of transmitting and responding to events. It's not observable like the term is commonly used, but we call observable is for transmitting and responding to events. And there is the router, as you mentioned. What else do we have, Gianluca? Okay, well.
Sorry, I couldn't hear anymore. My internet connection is really bad.
Why don't you repeat the question, Justin?
Yeah, so we were just talking about, like, what are some of the features that Riot has that developers may not know about? Because given its size, it actually has quite a few features that maybe developers just haven't heard about.
Yeah, the thing is, Riot, for example, in next release, we are going to remove the router from Riot because we want to be really a full stack. We don't want to be a full stack library. We just want to be a Vue library that you can use just with whatever framework you want in your backend with the Flux, React, or no, React probably is not the case, but whatever backend framework you want to use, your data. It could be used with anything. It's going to be just a Vue library. So at the moment, we implement our custom router that is pretty small, and it looks kind of page.js. So it's really simple. But in the end, in the next release, we are going to remove some features to allow developers using whatever they want to manage their data structure. Plus, I guess on next releases, we want to allow developers also to update the DOM however they want. So I guess in the next releases, I will implement a method to evaluate and to interpolate the expressions we get from a template and to implement a real virtual DOM. This is something that is on my to-do list. But back to what Sharon said, right. It's important that if you're going to pick a framework, you're going to check if this is going to be maintained by a big community, a small community. Is there a big company behind it? But you need to consider that on Riot, we actually maintain daily we respond daily to all the issues that get posted on the repo. We have an average about around 2 releases per month, 2 patch releases. So together with the company behind the framework, you need also to get the data that actually the data behind the framework. So we really use a lot in professional apps. It's actually used on some backend tools. So it's not just jokes, right? It's really a big piece of code, and it's gonna stay there for quite a long time. It's not just a side project or a weekend project. We are pushing this really forward.
So, talking about sort of the way Riot does custom tags, you have a very sort of declarative approach where you can sort of combine and use HTML with your JavaScript, sort of in this custom tag or custom element sort of approach. What kind of, how does that sort of work, and what kind of benefits does Riot see in terms of that, taking that approach as a developer?
Exactly, that's a cool question, I would say. The thing is that you can build your tags however you want. That's the cool part of Riot, because if you want to split your template in a separate file, you can do it with Riot. If you want to build your components in one single file, you can do it with Riot. If you want to build your CSS in your components together with your JavaScript and your template, you can do it, but you can also not do it. Or if you like to code in CoffeeScript, you can do it. Or if you want to do it, you use a different template engine, you can do it in Riot. So basically, it gives you more possibilities, it allows you to write your code in the most creative way. So, for example, just to give you a practical example, in my company, I have several PHP developers, and they want to build their components in separate files, so splitting the logic and the template. Basically, they just include the template in a JavaScript file using Webpack or Rollup or whatever tool, and they implement logic in a JavaScript file. That's how they use Riot. I use Riot in separate components, mixing JavaScript and CSS. And you can use Riot however you want, but it allows you to do that. And that's the cool part of Riot, I guess.
I think also the component-based approach, you write your component and then you put together your application using them components. So if I have an input component that I want to use for, a date range picker or what have you, I just put, date range picker component on my page, and anybody looking at that can see, oh yeah, that's where the date range picker goes. So if they want to restyle the page or whatever, they know that that's where it is, and it's pretty obvious. So it's kind of, web components and the other component libraries like React and I know Vue and Knockout, and some other people have components also that give you that same advantage. So also, going back to other features, you can use a standard element as a component with Riot. That's one thing that may not be obvious. You can give it we have an attribute called data is, kind of like just is in web components. So I can attach to a div or any type of HTML element, H1, whatever UL, I can attach a Riot component directly to it, and it won't be that. That is less semantic, but it gives you more flexibility for CSS frameworks that might really be looking for a specific pattern of, UL, LI kind of thing. I can make a component and attach it directly to an element like that. And also, we have some things coming in version 3 where you can do dynamically created elements where you don't really have to know ahead of time what it is. It could be based on user actions or data you get from the server, and then just based by the tag name, it's along that same lines of attaching to an element. You take my calendar picker example, my date range picker example. I just look at the server and I see that it's a date range type of input. I can attach that to it and dynamically create it just by putting the expression for that data is attribute. So that will be coming in the version 3, and also that can input. It can be on the presentation, and if you don't know if you're going to be displaying a scatter plot diagram or a bar chart or a pie chart or whatever, you can have a component in place and then have that expression. That's something to look forward to in the version 3 when it comes out.
Has anybody produced a collection of commonly used components for Riot yet?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a Riot here, and also a material component library just built on top of Riot. You need just to go on our repo and you will find in README file all the components. You will find a lot of links there.
Okay.
Then we have some guys who have developed components, custom components. I think it's a good place to start. And also we have a separate repo that contains a lot of examples where you can find out how you can build your components with Webpack, with Rollup, just including them in the page, using our compiler, however you want.
Okay.
So in terms of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think I want just to say that the feedback I got by using Riot from a lot of users, it's also that some developers always frustrated about the current web development. So about the huge amount of tools you need to manage every day. They just said, hey, by using Riot, I just realized that I'm happy again developing web interfaces because it's not that complicated. And I mean, once you hear those words or you get this kind of feedback, this is what pushes you working on the project, because I think it's important that if you work 8 days, so 7 days or how many days per week on a project and 8 hours per day and so on, you should enjoy what you're doing, or at least you shouldn't be frustrated wasting time running npm install, npm update. With Riot, you will solve these kind of problems because it's really simple. You just put it somewhere in your page and it's gonna work out of the.
So in terms of the custom element portion of it, you know, is it sort of built on top of sort of the web component specs that are sort of now starting to land? I mean, you look at things like sort of the web component specs that are within Chrome, for instance, and the stuff that's now starting to land in Firefox and the things that Edge are working on. I mean, does it work in a very similar manner? Does it have similar life cycle sort of events that occur on on elements as they're sort of stamped into the DOM?
Yeah, the thing is that, as I said before, we are trying to use whatever is already available. So for us, a web component, it's simply a template that is self-contained, has its own logic, its own template. So what we do actually, it's really simple to render this thing. We just take the template, we interpolate these template nodes, mixing the variables inside the template to actually render the markup. And on the top of the page, the CSS gets appended. It's really simple. We don't use any shadow DOM or any USpec. This doesn't mean that in future Riot won't be using those properties. But the fact is that we need to support also old browsers. I mean, Riot runs also on Internet Explorer 9. You should consider that even if it's a small library, it's going to work also on one of the oldest Internet Explorer. And this is something that we need to consider, because we do really actually projects that get outside here, and we need to support also the old browsers as well. We won't use weird fancy ECMAScript properties and so on. We just want to use what actually is available already and works pretty well.
So in that regard, you know, do you find a lot of call for developers who want to support older IEs, for instance? Because I know that, you know, within the framework communities and a lot of the library sort of developers these days, it is somewhat of a debate, correct, about, you know, should we continue to support IE, given that even Microsoft to some extent is like, we're moving on to Edge and we're trying to get everyone to come with us at this point. You know, it's sort of been a long-standing debate, but I mean, where do you guys sort of stand on that? Do you find a lot of people using Riot with IE9 and older browsers?
Listen, when we dropped Internet Explorer 8, sorry, go forward.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that, yeah, we just recently dropped support for IE8, and I know Edge is definitely a big improvement, and I'll be happy when that's in full force, but it's not yet. So I think IE support is still somewhat important. I have a Windows 8 laptop that I'm on here. I tried to upgrade to Windows 10, and I had no network connection, and that was after waiting about a year for my hardware to be approved. So I don't really know where Microsoft is going or how fast they will get there, but I don't use IE myself, but my machine does not support Edge, so I really kind of think that I'm sure there are a lot of people out there like me that would like to go to Windows 10 but can't, or just they have older machines running and they just want to don't upgrade for whatever reason. And I think it's good to still keep some support, at least probably. I don't know. It depends on Microsoft really. Whenever Windows 10 can be fully supported by all the hardware and everybody's using it, I think that's a year or two down the road probably. So.
That this does mean that when we dropped Internet Explorer 8, there was a huge flame. You should also consider that. I mean, once we dropped Internet Explorer 8 in a minor release, people was going crazy about that. They just said, you don't support Internet Explorer, how we're going to do on our Chinese products and so on. So it was a big problem for a lot of users. So I think the old browser support is still quite an important topic today.
Yeah, and I think a lot of frameworks underestimate it. They're so used to developing for evergreen browsers that they completely forget about huge installed bases of older browsers.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, this is true. I mean, I think that's why the debate continues to sort of rage on. I mean, in terms of, you look at things like IE10, right? IE10 is technically out of support. I mean, it was out of support in January, if I'm not mistaken. I think the only thing you can reasonably get it on now is 2012 server, or a few different versions of Windows left that only support 10. So you do have but you do have a significant corporate influence, and I'm always curious. I mean, for the bigger projects, at some point you have to make the decision, is my 1% gain in that particular market worth the rest of my gain or not, right? And I'm not working on frameworks at the moment, so I can say that and say, I don't know what we should do, because that's just the way this generally works when you're the talking head on a particular thing. So it's always curious to me, when IE gets brought up, particularly because of so much progress that we've all made towards newer specs and newer standards. But there is still that, I must support this thing because I have clients or corporations or someone that I'm built this thing for, that it must continue to run on, IE whatever.
And that's how it works.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's, it's every sort of library and framework has to make that choice, and I'm just always curious. So you mentioned that the way that CSS works for your components and things. I mean, how do you guys do scoping? Like, I mean, Shadow DOM, which is sort of upcoming. It's in Chrome now. Firefox is, and everybody else is sort of working on it these days. How do you guys do scoping? Because you look at like Polymer, and Polymer has Shady DOM, and then that sort of they have their own scoping mechanism within it. How do you guys end up with scoping? Because I know scoping is such a pain.
You're right. You're right. But as I said, we always try to get the easiest solution out of the specs. So basically, if you write a style inside your tag and you add the scoped properties, you just scope your CSS to your tag. So if you write a P and you have your tag that is, let's say, person, we are gonna to output this CSS as a person P. So it's really simple, and we append this property on the top of the page. But actually, you're not you don't need to stick to our compiler. But basically, you can also output your CSS. And by the way, we support any kind of CSS preprocessor. This is also something you should consider. We allow developers using whatever CSS preprocessors they use and also whatever template engine they want to use. This is also important to mention. Do you want to add anything, Richard?
No, that pretty well covers it.
So yeah, in
Cool.
terms of sort of the way that scoping can be hard. I mean, especially when you sort of promote CSS into sort of the head, and then you've got sort of this generated scope style. Because you guys are using colon scope, which my presumption is you're not actually using the colon scope spec so much as you're looking for colon scope and sort of escalating that into basically a selector that says you will only work for this component that's injected into the DOM. Is that a safe assumption?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly, yes.
Exactly. But also
because I know that the colon scope thing was something that was in Firefox for a while, if I remember correctly, in terms of the spec.
I don't know. Those are stuff honestly I never needed in my whole life as a developer. I mean, actually, Riot is it's a tool that you need to use daily. So you need to get your job done. And your boss comes to you and says, hey, Gianluca, we have this project and we need to finish it, I don't know, in 2 weeks. And you need to have a sort of library, a sort of helpers that allow you to do that thing in the most sane way you could do it. And for me, the most sane way is the most obvious way to do it. So this means that, for example, if I need special CSS that could be dynamically rendered and somehow applied to the component, Riot allows it just scoping your CSS, or also even just doing inline styling. So our expressions get also applied to the CSS. So if you have a style and you want to change the font size, for example, in runtime, you just apply an expression to your component, and then this is going to be evaluated and applied in DOM. I mean, I think there's nothing simpler than that.
So for a lot of these components, you know, when we talk about components, the beauty of components is that they can be reusable, right? I want to reuse this component in XYZ. How does it play with other components? Like if I pull something off customelements.io and I slap it into my project, and then I've got a Riot.js custom tag in there. I mean, do these things all play nicely together? Can I use query selector or query selector all and start pulling things of that nature?
It's just JavaScript. You can use whatever a JavaScript allows you to do. So recently I made a project with Material by Google, Material Lite, and it just played awesomely with Riot. I just apply. I mean, it really is plain JavaScript. It's just a small wrapper around your stuff you're doing for daily. I mean, instead of having a jQuery spaghetti code, Riot just gives you a kind of organization of your code base.
And is it one of those things that if I want to install a Riot.js component in my particular project, like if I'm doing integration somewhere and I'm like, oh, I really like that component, like what would be the steps to like sort of start using Riot within an existing project today? Like how does that sort of play out?
It depends on what you want. The thing is that if you use a Webpack, you can just npm install Riot, and Webpack has a tag loader that is a special plugin to compile your tags directly in Webpack, and you just require your tag and you mount it. I mean, for those stuff, I think it's our example repo. It's really an awesome place. You shouldn't underestimate the value of this repo. There you can have all the special cases where you can use a Riot component, either embed it in the page, either load it with Webpack, with Rollup, or whatever tool you want to use. It's really simple because it is nothing fancy. It's really simple. You need to try it out.
And we'll make sure to put in the show notes because you guys have a lot of examples of sort of you have the basic examples, and then but you have a significant example library of both components and sort of the way projects are set up and sort of those integrations that are there now, correct?
Yeah, because anyone wants to do the same stuff in 1,000 different ways. That's the problem of web development. So we think that our current tech stack is different for any one of us, and we tried with Riot to fit any kind of need, because probably I use Webpack, you want to use Browserify, I want to use Bubble.js, and someone else wants to use some. So I mean, it's so difficult to find a good way that works for anyone, but Riot really plays this role pretty well, because it allows you to use whatever CSS preprocessor and whatever template engine and even whatever JavaScript. It works even with TypeScript. I mean, I honestly, I just use JavaScript and ECMAScript 6, but it allows you everything. And yeah, you're right. It's pretty big, the examples, just because the web community has a lot of needs.
Well, examples are a good way to, it makes life easier for a developer who's just starting out with any particular library or framework or any of that nature. Because I mean, there is, even with a small subset of API calls, you can end up with sort of a, it's kind of a rabbit hole, right? You start down one path because you want to do something very simple, and then all of a sudden, 3 hours later, you're knee deep in something entirely beyond what you were, which is pretty much me browsing the internet on any given day. But from a developer standpoint, things need to get done, and having examples there quickly can really sort of solidify that. And you guys have a great set of examples.
Yeah.
So we're running up against time here, pretty quick-like, but and I'm sure I haven't covered or said as much or covered things that we probably should have covered. Sharon will take me to task later for this. What have we missed? What did we not talk about, Riot, that you all would like to make sure developers out there know?
Richard?
Well, I think we pretty much hashed it over pretty well. I mean, the simplicity of it, easy to get up to speed on it, the easy to, like Gianluca was saying, to explain it to other people what your code is and what it's doing. It's just so concise, and I think that's a big thing. And I don't know, that's what attracts a lot of people to it. But I'm sure I'll remember a dozen other things I wish I talked about once we get off air, but that's how it goes.
And we can stick those in the show notes, Richard. It'll be fine.
Okay, good.
But
Gianluca, what did we miss?
Yeah, I want to add something. So the thing is that this is out of the scope. So basically, what I really like about Riot is that the community behind it. The thing is that if we need to take a decision, being a group of people working on the project, each decision is discussed on the repo. I try to publish a roadmap for the version number 3, and the awesome ideas, they get included in next release. And this is something that I found it was really hard on the other projects I liked before. Projects like, I would mention one, Backbone, for example. If I would like to implement a feature in Backbone, the only way to implement this feature is to build another framework like Marionette or Layout Manager on the top of Backbone. The difference here is that if someone has a cool idea, he would just open an issue on the repo, and if this issue gets a lot of votes and it gets popular, we try to implement it in the best way we could. And this is, I think, it's an awesome idea behind. We try to avoid those JavaScript drama and those weird stuff that always happen in the JavaScript community. We are pretty democratic. That's the most beautiful thing about Riot.
Well, and it makes issue tracking way more interesting.
Really
right?
like it. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic.
I mean, sometimes I'm not.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I'm sorry. There's a bit of lag, and I think we're talking over each other.
Yeah, but sometimes I'm also frustrated because there are weird. I mean, recently something I received, a guy just said, "Is Riot Dad?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Yeah, it's 7 days that there's no commit on the repo." And I said, "Jesus Christ, man, this is something that I mean, we are working in our spare time on this project. You just let, we made 2 releases in the last month. Just give us the time. I mean, you can't ask more. And this is pretty funny, but despite that, I mean, I try to be always friendly, and I try to be always a nice guy, and I try to drink less coffee. But it's hard. I mean,
No, don't drink
No,
less
don't
coffee.
do that.
No. Let's stay sane here. Let's, I gotta go get my other pot here in a second. It's funny. I had somebody do that exact same thing to me yesterday. Is your project dead? And I'm like, I don't. We literally have a meetup tomorrow. Like I don't. What? So I always find the "is X dead" lines of logic really kind of funny, because I think that if you run any sort of project with any sort of following, even a little bit, eventually you're going to get that question.
exactly.
I think we just made developers so paranoid.
Well, this is true too, right? There is some paranoia around, like, oh my gosh, nothing
Did I
looks like it's
pick the
happening.
loser? Oh my god.
So I
That
think
is
that's
for
about
sure.
the time that we have. Richard, Gianluca, where can people find you on the inner tubes to contact you about Riot and/or other random things?
GitHub.
I'm on the Riot project. GitHub is the best place. I'm RS Bondi, like Richard Steven is my full name. RS Bondi.
Or on Twitter if you want. Twitter GianlucaGuarini. You will find it somehow.
We will put it in the show notes, all the contact
Yeah,
information
okay,
and
awesome.
links. So if you have questions about Riot.js or random web things, you can reach out to Gianluca and Richard. Sharon, what else did I miss? I probably missed much more on this.
Too late.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yes. See, and Sharon keeps me honest as we run these sorts of things. So this has been episode 83,
Okay,
an introduction to Riot.js. I want to thank Gianluca. I want to thank Richard for coming on the show. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being on the show.
And thank you for having us.
Thank you too.
Sharon, always a
Yeah.
pleasure. Friend of the show, always around to make sure Justin's not completely off the rails when Eric's not here. Thank you so much for being on here, Sharon.
You're welcome.
Thank you too.
And this has been another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. We will see you next time.